A quick intro. So Fergus Gleeson is a consultant radiologist and he's a professor of radiology, of which I believe, Fergus, there are a mixed bag of men and women. So not that it's a competition, but we seem to be doing better than the urologists on that. And he's the head of academic radiology at Oxford. He directs the Oxford Imaging Trials Unit, and he's got extensive research in thoracic imaging. And today, I think he's going to be talking to us about his AI work. I believe he is the Chief Medical Officer for the National Consortium of Intelligent Medical Imaging, and is also leading a large collaborative effort to develop AI for lung cancer. So thank you, Fergus, and over to you.
So thank you very much. And here we go. There's a couple of grants which Shonitz have mentioned, and I've got a couple of startups, as you can see there. The one to mention, I will relate to Optellum and the Innovate UK grant. So just to highlight those for you. There's been a whole bunch of stuff about AI replacing doctors and things like that, and people have got ahead of themselves. If I get to this bit, this was published about 4 years ago, and people are saying that actually, well, we can identify cats on the internet, so we can sure as heck identify nodules on CT and things like that, and relate them. It's slightly more complex because if you look, the current state of AI in imaging is narrow and task specific. It's one thing alone, whereas fortunately humans, and including radiologists, do slightly more complex tasks. So that's why it's taken longer than Google and Facebook and everybody else thought it would take. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a general discussion, and then I'm going to relate that along the way to pulmonary nodules and my experience. And then in the end, we'll get to the bit I think is key for image interpreters of all types. And I think there's an increasing number of people that aren't radiologists interpreting imaging, and I think in the future they will be more than there are radiologists. And apologies to all babies in prams. I'm going to use a baby in a pram as an example and compare the baby in the pram to a pulmonary nodule on CT. And we've all decided on this meeting, we're going to identify an algorithm to produce an algorithm to identify babies in prams and to characterize them. And it's really easy, isn't it? We all know what a baby in a pram looks like, and we're going to have hundreds of thousands of images to be able to help us develop and validate the algorithm. But our problems start with not all babies are the same, and not all pulmonary nodules are the same. So how have we defined a pulmonary nodule? Is it a solid, a semi-solid, a cystic? Do we all agree when a pulmonary nodule is no longer a pulmonary nodule, or a baby is no longer a baby but a toddler? And how do you measure it? Height, walkability, age, etc. So it starts to get complex when we're having conversations with the sites about what babies in prams we want them to send us, or what pulmonary nodules. And then have we defined what a pram is, what the CT is? Because you get prams of all different types and sizes, and you get CTs of all different types. The one on the left is a coronary artery CT with a contrast, and the one on the right is a low dose, high res CT detecting a pulmonary nodule. Do we want them all? Do we want specific ones? How many of the left or how many of the right do we want? And then unfortunately for us, but fortunately for us as humans, pathways and technologies change. And Caroline produced a fantastic example of prostates prostate MR changing the pathway. Well, there we were in 1922, way ahead, a century ahead of everybody else, and we developed the most fantastic algorithm for a pram. But unfortunately, modern prams don't look like that any longer. And for CT and other technologies, that's changing too. We've got spectral CT happening. We've got ultra low dose, very high res CT. We've got digital PET come along. So is our algorithm, can we put the data from that into our algorithm development, and will it work when the technology changes? And then someone says, well, actually, we're going to protect the data of the privacy of those babies in the prams. We're going to leave the babies in the prams where they are, whether they're in Glasgow, Cornwall, or Oxford. And we're going to move the algorithms to them to learn from. And that's called federated learning. But of course, unless someone sends me a picture of the baby in the pram, I won't know whether they've identified it correctly. Their pram may be different from my pram. So their nodule may be different from my nodule, what I would agree as a nodule, and how have they proven it's a nodule? It's quite tricksy, this. We may need more than 100,000 images. And then, of course, the images often aren't great. Sometimes they include the whole background, sometimes they're black and white, sometimes they're tiny, sometimes they're blurred. And the same is true of the pulmonary nodules, because if we include scans that include the base of the lungs from a CT colon or a KUB, there may be motion artifact. The patient may have been breathing because no one's very interested in that bit of it. So how do we measure image quality to be able to develop these algorithms? And then we're going to determine how big that baby's going to be from a single image. And of course, we don't do that. So what we need are lots of images over a time course. So actually, it's not a baby in a pram we need, it's the baby in the pram at different times to know how big it's going to get. You know, the nodule there on the left, we'd likely ignore. The nodule on the right, if we compared to the nodule on the left, we'd be slightly more worried about it. We'd be looking at the baby that was now a young boy and thinking, it's quite a big young 3-year-old. And then by the time of 11, even bigger. And the nodule is definitely one to worry about. For those of you wondering who that toddler is, that's Arnie. So it's very difficult to go from the first nodule to know that you're going to get a cancer, etc. Does this happen? Yeah, it does happen. In this paper here from Google, they showed that actually radiologists perform better when they're able to see the prior imaging. And they could outdo or be as good as an algorithm just from one image when the radiologist had multiple. But we don't have multiple data sets for algorithms, or they're often just used on one. What about the context of it? We've trained out, I'm sorry, I don't have a baby on the roof of a farm or anything like that, but we've got a duck looking at television over there or a snowman in the summer. We know that that's the wrong context. We know that that's not appropriate, but the algorithm doesn't. And that is important in terms of how we've validated the algorithm. So this is an example of a pneumothorax. Now, the algorithm can clearly identify the pneumothorax there on the left because it's huge. The pneumothorax on the right occurs when there's a chest drain in situ, so we're less fussed about that. But the pneumothorax on the far right, we don't know whether it's a pneumothorax. And actually, there isn't ground truth, and we don't know how important that is. And that's probably not going to be included in the development of the algorithms, or if you like, the pulmonary nodules, when we just don't know whether it's ground truth or not. And you might think, well, we'll go off and get ground truth. We'll get a CT for the pneumothoraces. And then the CT shows a pneumothorax, but that doesn't mean you can see it on the chest X-ray. So determining ground truth and determining how it's been used for the algorithm is very difficult. Okay, so that's sort of background. And now if we look at CAD, and there's 4 different types of it: CAD-Q for quantification, CAD detection, which is CAD-E, CAST is simple triage, and CAD-X is computer-aided diagnosis. CAD-X is the one that all of us think about in terms of that's what we're interested in, the algorithm helping us to make a better diagnosis. But in fact, we probably want, I'm not sure about computer-aided simple triage, we can come to that in question time, but we want some help with CAD-Q and CAD-E. So when we get a pulmonary nodule, we're now going to move specifically onto pulmonary nodules and AI involvement in it. There we go. There's our CT. It's got a pulmonary nodule. When we look at it, we take into account whether it's new, cancer history, smoking history, etc. All of these biases. What type of patient, how old are they, young, comorbidities, what pathway was the nodule detected in? Do they have a rectal cancer or a prostate cancer or a pancreatic cancer? And we know which ones are more likely to metastasize, etc. Or is it screening? The acquisition that's required, is it a high-res acquisition? Is it thick section? Was contrast given? What was the dose? What are the different scanners it was used on? Those things all have to be taken into account. There's no point in showing an algorithm that's been developed, a scan that's got contrast on it, if it's never seen scans that have got contrast on them. There's little point in showing them a high-res, low-dose one unless they've been trained on it as well. So all of those have to be taken into account. So if we look at how they're doing for detection, we know that early detection of lung cancers in lung cancer screening and in general improves survival. And actually now we know it decreases mortality, survival being a lead time bias probability. We know that we miss cancers both on chest x-ray, and here's one of my misses on CT. I thought it was a bit of vessel. You can see it tucked down there. So anything that helps us is worthwhile. And there's a vast amount of literature out there, started 20 years ago when we were told to use or shown to use MIPS, all the way through to CAD at the bottom right, showing that actually detection of pulmonary nodules using AI improves things. But if you look, they come with a fair number of caveats. The biggest caveats now are, can you build it into your workflow? Can you use CAD detection for nodules detected at a lung base on CT colon and compare it to a CT pulmonary angiogram? And the answer is that's really difficult, because most of the CAD detection tools have been used for low-dose CT for lung cancer screening. They also, showing you the ones on the left versus the right, versus the one on the right, haven't been used in patients with UIP and interstitial lung disease. So they're unreliable for those patient groups. But actually, do people know that when they're using them? Are they sold with that as a caveat? So you need to think about, when you evaluate CAD detection algorithms, not just the results that are shown, but the inclusion and the exclusion criteria, what comparator groups, types of scanner, how generalizable it is, what was the pretest probability in the group, i.e. lung cancer screening versus incidental nodules. Critically, who will use it and how will they be trained to use it? And then, as I talked about, workflow for interoperability. And then who on earth is going to pay for it? Is it a additional cost, or is it a cost out model? What about measurement and diagnosis? Well, at the moment, if you have a nodule detected, we follow the BTS guidelines, and there are a variety of pathways to follow about watching the nodules get bigger, measuring the volume. And here is one of the algorithms that we use to assess using the Brock model. And what you do is you put the data into this model, and it gives you a probability of the patient having a lung cancer. We have developed a tool from Optum called the Lung Cancer Prediction Convolutional Neural Network model, and we've shown that it outperforms Brock a little bit, but it does outperform it, so it's better, reduces biopsies, etc. So how is it doing that? Is it actually just a better way of measuring the size of the nodule? So we did a study that's just been published, that the manual diameter of patients from the National Lung Cancer Screening Trial in the States, where there were nodules, and we used caliper measures, and then we had some software that's free to use on the internet, which we developed to actually, which we modified so it can actually measure the size of the nodule, produce a sphere, and then produce the spherical diameter, and we compared it to the lung cancer prediction model. And what we showed was the lung cancer prediction model outscored all different ways of measuring the diameters and putting them into the Brock model. So is it really just a clever way of measuring size? Is that what these algorithms are doing? So what we did was we looked at the parameters we understood. We took the nodules. We then looked at the parenchyma just to the right of it by about 15 millimeters on the left. We moved the algorithm away. We covered up the background, and then we covered up the nodule. So we had 4 different ways of looking at it. And what we showed, and the interesting thing here, is that the algorithm takes them all into account, but and beats the Brock model. But interestingly, is actually just looking at the lung parenchyma alone, is better than chance or the Brock model without morphological features for determining whether the patient has lung cancer, i.e. it's actually looking at something in the lung itself. And so that may mean that we may be able to add this into a way of determining who we should screen in the future. So we've got a model that works for pulmonary nodules. You're going to buy it because you're convinced, and I have a few shares in it. No, I don't really, a tiny, tiny amount. So that's not the reason for you buying it, but kind of you. But here we are, we're going to use it. So it's game over for all of us. But is it? Well, it isn't, because we've discussed earlier that sometimes the images aren't good enough and humans are able to do it. And here's my favorite slide from COVID, where chest X-ray was trained to identify, a chest X-ray algorithm was trained to identify COVID on a chest X-ray. And then it was shown a cat, and it was more convinced the cat had COVID than on the chest X-rays. And the reason for that was the algorithm had never seen a cat before. And don't forget, it's not seeing a cat, it's just seeing dots and dashes or noughts and ones. So in other words, we're able to say, don't use it because it's not of use in that instance. Don't use the algorithm because it's not of use, etc. But is that right? So here is the Optellum algorithm that's been used on this, and we had a number of different readers, and they scored the likelihood of this and other nodules being cancer, and then we gave them the algorithm and asked them to rescore it as to whether it was likely to be cancer or not. And all of the readers got better, all of them. But what we don't know specifically, we do, but it's a complex thing to do and wasn't relevant to what I'm saying to you about they all got better, but is relevant for each individual nodule. Do you know for each individual nodule whether the algorithm's better than you? And do you know how good you are when reading a scans? How do you know that? How good do you know you are at reading prostate MRs compared to an algorithm? The answer is you don't, because you haven't measured yourself. So how can you believe the algorithm when you don't know whether it's better than you for any individual nodule? So who should use these algorithms? Do you have to be Einstein, or can any old Muppet use it? How do you train people to use these algorithms? And then what about the future after we use them? Well, we've talked about algorithms. They're not going to replace humans in the near future for diagnosis. They will for measurement where the algorithms work, I think, and they probably will for detection where the algorithms work. But actually, they probably work better when they're combined with humans. And this is one of the things that we're doing in DART, which is the lung cancer screening study that we've got with about 600,000 participants, where we're going to collect all the data, the clinical data, pathology, which we're going to digitize, the CT data, blood biomarkers, and we're going to use multimodal algorithm development to try and predict who's got cancer and avoid biopsies. And then we're going to use with the same data sets, we've started to develop this algorithm. So what this algorithm is, that is a static chest CT, 1 liter breath hold, static. We do the CT, we then put in the lung function data, we then put in tissue density measured on CT, and it produces a respiratory map from the patient's CT. So we're able to look to see individual areas of ventilation in individual lobes using an algorithm. Humans will never be able to do that. So that's true multimodal AI for the future. So I'll stop by showing you this slide and then able to answer questions. You're looking at this slide and you're either looking at a young woman with a nose there and a chin there, or you're looking at an old lady with a nose there and her chin there and a mouth and a scarf, etc. Or you can swap between the two. So you are able to adjust your opinion of what you're looking at depending upon what you need to do and when you choose to do it. Algorithms can't do that. So they've got a long way to go yet. They can't manage uncertainty and they can't manage multiple interpretations. Thank you very much.